Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. Can we give her another one, a round of applause, please? I'm Dr. Santana, and I've had the distinct pleasure and privilege of serving this university now, going on to 16 years. And every day, I'm amazed at the talent within our community, within our student body, within our staff, within our faculty. Now, every day I get moments of inspiration as I interact with each and every single one of you. I would like to begin the day by saying, can we give a round of applause and thank you to Mr. Nathan Morrell and the rest of the suicide prevention team. We are here today as a community to bring awareness of suicide, depression, and mental illness. We are here today to pause, reflect, and remember loved ones and friends who are no longer with us. They are no longer with us because they may have been afraid, they may have been overwhelmed, they may have been ashamed, embarrassed, sad, angry, and many other words that that I can't even describe or recite today. In his work, The Arteries of Innocence, William Blake opens by stating, "To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." If each of us was able to do this at least once in our life, maybe we would have made different choices. Our friends, our families may have done just the same. When a person gives up on their life, they arrive at what they believe is the point of no return. But only if they had held out for one more second, one more minute, one more hour, one more month, one more year, the dark clouds would dissipate. The crushing weight of depression would subside. What may have seemed hopeless is no longer, because they discover within Pandora's box a new hope. We can only arrive at this point or this new manifestation through a term which we have endeavored to describe as resilience. Resilience will get you through it. Not being afraid to ask for help will get you through it. Eradicate stigma today and tell your friends and loved ones it is okay to ask for help. Say, it is okay to ask for help. Now on to introducing our guest speaker for the closing ceremonies of Suicide Prevention Month. Dr. Santa Ono was born in St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver in 1962 when his father was a professor at the University of British Columbia, and was raised in Philadelphia and in addition to the northern suburbs of Baltimore, Maryland, where he attended Towson High School. His parents left post-war Japan when his father, an accomplished mathematician, was lured to Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies by the director, Robert Oppenheimer, on the recommendation of the famed mathematician Andrew Weil. His family then moved to Vancouver when his father accepted a faculty position in the University of Vancouver's math department. They named their son after Santaro, a Japanese folk story character. A few years later, his family moved back to the United States, and although he has spent most of his life outside Canada, Ono did have memorable experiences there at McGill University, where he earned not only his PhD in experimental medicine, but also the hand of his Chinese-Canadian wife, Wendy Yip. As a professor of medicine and biology, Ono has worked at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University College of London, and Emory Universities. He was also inducted by Johns Hopkins into the Society of Scholars, which honors former faculty who have gained distinction in their fields. He is also a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Ono's research encompasses the immune system, eye inflammation, and age-related macular degeneration, a leading cause for blindness. As a university administrator, Ono, also known for his vision beyond the laboratory, he was the first Asian American president of the University of Cincinnati when he was appointed in 2012. Previously, he served as the university provost and senior vice president for academic affairs. Prior to his recruitment to the University of Cincinnati, Ono was the senior provost and deputy to provost at Emory University. Ono is deeply committed to diversity, and his achievements have been recognized by the American Council on Education with an award that honors individuals who have demonstrated leadership and commitment on a national level to the advancement of racial and ethnic minorities in higher education. He also received a Professional Achievement Award from the University of Chicago Alumni Association in 2017, an honor he shares with such luminaries as Carl Sagan, Ed Asner, and Kurt Vonnegut. In addition, Inside Higher Education named him America's most notable university president in 2015. His many followers on Twitter and Instagram know why he deserves that accolade. He's adept in using social media to respond quickly and directly to people's concerns and to make personal, authentic connections, in particular with students. Whether sending congratulatory tweets to grads, cheering the home team, or responding to someone's concerns about financial aid, it is all about engagement. Ono has used social media to spread awareness about mental illness and to share his own struggles as a high-achieving student who battled and beat depression. The response has been overwhelming, Ono says. Suicide is a real risk for university-age youth, and we need to know where they are. We need to let them know that they are not alone. So without any further delay, I present to you our speaker for this morning, Dr. Santa Ono.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful to be with you today. We've been planning this dialogue for approximately half a year, and in looking up Stockton University on YouTube and on the internet, just blown away with how beautiful this campus is and how far it's really come in a pretty short period of time. I just met with the president, your beloved president, and he showed me where he went to school when this was a much younger institution. And what's happened here is simply breathtaking. It is really a miracle of higher education. And I hope that you are proud of being part of such a great institution. And the other thing that really blew me away was not just the growth and stature of this university, but also the commitment to the wellness of students, staff, and faculty here. I love the fact that there's actually a phrase called Stockton friendly, which is something that I think more universities ought to embrace. And I love the fact that you have a whole month focused on mental wellness. And I've encouraged administrators here to actually take a video using some of the drones that they have of the suicide walk that actually occurs here with about 1,100 candles lit at dusk, with about 500 students actually walking past Lake Fred all the way around campus. That is really a powerful visual that I think should happen on all university campuses around the world. It is really a privilege for me to be here with you today. I flew into Newark yesterday evening and have been looking forward to having this conversation with you. Hopefully, I was asked to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then have open it up to question and answers, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. And I want to start off with this first slide. How many of you have actually read this book, The Little Engine That Could? So I don't really have to get into great detail about what it's about, but there are a number of reasons why I want to talk about this book. First, it's one of my favorite, but it's also a favorite of another young gentleman that I want to talk a little bit about. And in many ways, it articulates a message, or a couple of messages that I think are central to our getting over stigma, the stigma of speaking about mental challenges, mental illness, but it also, I think, in many ways articulates where we want to go as a university community, as a society, in providing even more support for this really growing crisis in higher education. That is the issue of mental wellness in our K through 12 population of students, but also among university students, which is really the focus of today. But beyond students, I also want to talk a little bit through my story, that this is not something which is just about students, but that throughout one's life, whether you're a staff member, a university professor, or even an administrator, every person is really vulnerable to changes in their life that might really send them spiraling into difficulties with respect to their mental well-being. And I guess one of the key messages is that we need to be friendly to each other, to create a web of support, not just for the youngest members of our society, but also for people at every stage of their career. So that's why I want to start out with the cover of the Little Engine That Could, and you'll see the second significance of it as I move through my remarks. Now, today's story is really about, focuses on two individuals, but it's really about all of us. And any of you could be in this photograph. On the left side of the screen, you can see a picture of me when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And on the right side, you can actually see a photograph of someone called Brogan Dully. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his life and my life and hope that will be instructive to you about the challenges of suicide among young adults. The photograph on the left is a black and white photograph. It's actually lifted from my senior high school yearbook. And you can see how Brogan and I look that's me. It's amazing, it actually is me. And that was me in high school. And you see we're quite different. You heard a little bit about my biography. I'm an immigrant to North America. I was born in Vancouver, spent a good bit of time here on the eastern seaboard of the United States, in Philadelphia and in Baltimore. That's a picture of me at Towson High School. And for the students here, you probably have no idea what I'm standing behind and what I'm actually holding. This is before the age of computers and Netflix, before DVDs and there's a Blu-ray. Back then, when you watched a movie or some kind of audio-visual in high school, since none of that existed, there was something called a reel-to-reel projector. And being a pretty scrawny, dweeby, nerdy kid, I was a member of the audio-visual crew. I wasn't a member of the football team. I wouldn't have lasted more than the game. But that's what I did. And part of the story is about me. You can see on the right is a much more modern, contemporary photo of a young man called Brogan Dully. He was a student at the University of Cincinnati, as you heard, where I was president from 2012 to 2016, and I was there for 6 years being provost for a couple of years before being named president. And so I'm going to tell you about his story as well. As you can see, he was much more gregarious, fun-loving, very popular in his suburban community of Turpin outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And he was also, unlike me, very talented, not only academically but also as an athlete. He was a gifted swimmer, and he coached kids in the local swim club. And that's a little bit about what the story is about as well. So let me tell you a little bit about my life and how it relates to the topic of this month and how it relates to the message I want to give to you today. So what's not really clear in this photograph is what's going on inside of me. I look relatively happy there. But the year prior to that, at the age of 14, I attempted suicide for the first time. I've tried to commit suicide twice in my life, and I'll talk a little bit about what it was like at the age of 14. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I sort of reached those depths of despair that got me to ideate about committing suicide and actually trying to commit suicide at a pretty early age, at the age of 14. Well, one of the things that you might understand is that we came from an immigrant family. And one of the things that, in addition to genetics, that predisposes you to stresses are really trying to fit in. And some of you here are actually international students, and some of you probably have felt the same kinds of things I felt as a child. We grew up in a neighborhood where we were one of two Asian families in a predominantly Caucasian suburban neighborhood, first in Philadelphia and then in Baltimore, Maryland. And at that time, things weren't as progressive as they were today, and it wasn't that long after the World War II. And so there really was quite a bit of racism that still existed in the United States, and I and my two brothers experienced some racism in our neighborhoods. I remember that it wasn't that uncommon for us to be stopped in the street or even driving through New York City, where as little kids we're in the back seat and my parents were in the front seat. I remember somebody coming up to the car where we had stopped at an intersection and hammered the front of our car and said, "Go back to where you come from. You don't belong here." And I remember as a little kid just really being in horror that something like that could happen in the United States. And I remember my father getting out of the car and confronting the person and saying, "What are you talking about? This is America. This is where everyone belongs, and everyone should feel part of this country." So there was part of that behind sort of my insecurities in life, part of not really feeling as if I fit in high school. There were experiences at school where I was bullied. And there were times, for example, in the neighborhood where my little brother in his book talks about the time where a bunch of bigger kids grabbed him, took him in the forest, and stuffed a dead bird down his back. So that was part of the backdrop of not really feeling integrated into society. I'd say another part of what happened, the reason why I actually moved towards committing suicide, was that I really didn't feel as if my life was of value and that I really had much of a future at that age. You know, I come from a family with three brothers, and I have an older brother that's 3 years older who was a child prodigy. And he was playing with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, one of the great orchestras in the United States, and the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra at the age of 11, which is pretty remarkable. So that was my older brother. And he ended up actually becoming valedictorian and got accepted to Harvard and eventually went to Juilliard, and now is a concert pianist. So my older brother was pretty remarkable. And then I had a younger brother, 6 years younger. And first of all, it's sort of difficult being a middle child, but my younger brother was also pretty remarkable. And he, at a very young age, my father being a mathematician, was really impressed because he asked my little brother, probably only about 8 or 9 years old, about the meaning of the word infinity. And it's actually quite interesting right now because he was, just a couple years ago, a assistant producer of a film called The Man Who Knew Infinity. My brother is a mathematician, and he was a co-producer of a film about a great mathematician called Ramanujan, who was one of the greatest Indian mathematicians ever, a pure mathematician, and his story about how he immigrated to the United Kingdom and studied at Oxford and really revolutionized mathematics is really the topic of a Hollywood movie with Dev Patel and Jeremy Irons, and that movie is the movie that my younger brother was an assistant producer of. But even at the age of 8, my father, a mathematics professor, was really, really impressed with my younger brother because He said, there must be an infinity because whatever number you choose, if you call that number X, you can always add 1, so there's no last number. How many 8-year-olds can say that? Then there was me. I got a C in trigonometry. And, I don't think I love my parents, I don't think they meant to do this, but they said things in the presence of all 3 kids and friends and neighbors and fellow mathematicians that middle son is probably not going to amount to anything. That middle son maybe at best might be a manager in some sort of store in the neighborhood, but it's never going to amount to anything. And for a young child, I don't know if any of you have ever heard that kind of stuff, your whole world is defined by what your parents think about you. And I was already sort of destabilized by dealing with being different, looking different than all the other kids. And I was already not exactly confident about my abilities. But to feel that I wasn't going to amount to anything is really a crushing blow to a youngster. So one day, at the age of 14, when my parents were watching the news on television, I went to the fridge in the kitchen. I opened the door. I pulled out a can of beer. I'd never drunk anything for my entire life. I was probably less than 100 pounds at the age of 14. I took that bottle of beer, can of beer, and went to the medicine cabinet. Back then, there was adult cold medicine called Coricidin in these little red tablets. And at the age of 14, you really don't know what you're doing. You just know that you feel helpless. You feel as if there's no future to your life. And so they were watching the news. I walked up, went into my room, put a huge rock behind the door, opened the can of beer, took a handful of adult cold medicine, swallowed them with beer. And I got pretty groggy. And I think I didn't wake up until the afternoon the next day. My family never knew about it. They probably thought I was just sleeping in. But I woke up the next day. A lot of people talk about people who've tried to commit suicide, talk about what it feels like. Well, I'll tell you what I felt like back then. Some people, when they don't die, say that they're invigorated again. They're angry at themselves for having tried. And some of them actually approach life anew with more passion, more resilience. That wasn't the case for me because the underlying problems hadn't been addressed. And that's one of the messages I want to say to you is that if you're a little engine or a big engine struggling up a hill, you all read the book, sometimes you need help. Sometimes it's not enough to just say, I think I can, as the little engine said. Sometimes you need help. And at the age of 14, I didn't know what help meant, and I didn't have the maturity to actually seek help. And I was living at home. And part of the problem was that my parents didn't believe that I had a future, and I didn't believe I had a future, so I couldn't really talk to anybody about that. And back then, there weren't really enough counselors in public schools to even detect kids that were struggling. Not enough counselors to even work with them, which is something that's dramatically different here at Stockton University. And that's something that's very different from most other universities. The fact that there's no waiting list here, the fact that there are enough counselors and psychiatrists to work with you is something that really should be standard across all colleges and universities around the globe. So a salute to you, Stockton University, for what you do. So somehow I was able to finish high school and go to university, and I continued to struggle. Didn't know why. I still tried to deal with those demons in my head about being inadequate and having no future. But something inside me just kept me showing up at class, doing my best, sometimes doing well, sometimes not doing well. It was strange, moments where I felt really excited, and other times where I couldn't get out of bed. I was in my residence hall for 2 days. I wouldn't even get up to go eat. I was a total wreck, and my friends knew something was wrong, but my friends didn't know what to do. And that's another thing which is amazing about what's happening here at Stockton University and ought to happen everywhere, and that is we need to talk about this. Because one of the most important parts, pillars of the safety net, are one's peers. If you see someone not getting up, not going to class, not looking after their self-appearance, not eating, whether you're a student, a peer, a faculty member, an administrator, a coach, then learn about what it is that you can do to help them. That in and of itself can save lives. To wrap up with my story, just sort of to illustrate what's needed to be able to emerge from the dark cloud of depression. Somehow I finished University of Chicago. I went to graduate school, I even got married. And that's part of my salvation is I met somebody who cared about me, who introduced me to the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm a Christian now. I think that was a big part of me getting better. Believing in myself. Believing that I meant something. But then I became a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University, a great university. I was proud of that. I was starting to get the sense that my parents now felt that I was going to amount to something. But I still hadn't addressed the underlying problems in my life. And you have to address those problems at some time in your life. Otherwise, it keeps coming back if you have a mental illness like I do. So the second time I tried to take my life was when I was actually an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. It was a time when the economy was not very good in the United States and funding for scientists was at an all-time low. And so I tried really hard to get resources to support my students and to support the experiments. We're trying to understand why people get diabetes, and I was not able to get any funding from the National Institutes of Health. It's hard to do anyway, but back then it was nearly impossible if you were a new faculty member. And so I kept failing. So the second time I tried to take my life, it was a little bit more sophisticated. I knew more about what it would take than a 14-year-old. And I was separated from my wife. She was in Boston, I was in Baltimore, Washington, alone and feeling hopeless. Externally, people would say, he's successful. He's teaching at a great medical school. But inside, I hadn't dealt with the underlying problems. I still felt that I was inadequate compared to my father and my brothers. And I was feeling very lonely and hopeless. So even at that age, at the age of 39 years old, on a weekend, I went back into that shell, crawled up as a ball on my bed for days, and didn't even wake up on Monday, and I tried to commit suicide again. Nobody knew. That's another part of the story. The department chairman, my colleagues, the students, the dean, the president of the university, nobody knew. So this is not an issue just for young students, university students. It can happen to anyone at any time in their lives. It can happen to people with bona fide mental illnesses like I have, or it can happen to individuals that look perfectly normal, but are just actually presented with a huge trauma in their life, like losing a spouse, losing a parent, losing a boyfriend or girlfriend. Those kinds of traumas can take somebody that looks perfectly normal the year before and put them in a destabilized position. You know, the pathogenesis of mental illness is multifactorial. There are different kinds of mental illnesses. Some of them have a strong genetic component where multiple genes come together and predispose you for those sorts of mental illnesses, and others that really are a result of a life trauma. None of us are immune from some part of our life, some chapter in life, where we'll actually have to need the help of others. What's gotten me to this point now where I'm symptom-free is that the second time I tried to commit suicide, when I was an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins, fortunately, it was serious enough that I had to see professionals. I was admitted to the psychiatric hospital, the Shepherd Pratt Hospital, part of the Johns Hopkins University system. One of the great things was that the care that I got was anonymous. Nobody knew. And I was afraid that the stigma of being identified as someone who had ideated but also attempted suicide would actually be detrimental to my promotion as a faculty member at Johns Hopkins. So it was totally anonymous. Nobody knew, not even my wife. I was alone. But the great thing is that I was diagnosed with a mild form of bipolar disorder. As you know, that comes in different stages and different grades of severity. In my case, I was treated over a couple of years with a combination of psychiatric drugs, Zoloft, and psychotherapy. I'd say the most powerful part of the therapy really involved psychotherapy. Starting to deal with those feelings of inadequacy that started when I was a child and I hadn't addressed for all those years. Dealing with some tremendous traumas that occurred to me when I was a child that I can't even speak about today. Maybe I'll speak about them later in my life. But some of the kinds of traumas that many of you have actually experienced. Experiences such as abuse. Experiences such as moments where you think that your life is going to end. I experienced some of those things, and one day I'll talk a little bit about that. But all that wrapped up together required quite a bit of psychotherapy. And it saved my life. Being able to get beyond being worried about being exposed as someone with a mental health challenge and actually going to see a therapist and a psychiatrist and going through all that and taking medication, that saved my life. And the amazing thing is after that, over the next couple of decades, I've been symptom-free. It took a lot of different things. It took nutrition. It took proper sleep. It took going to church. It took rebalancing the focus of my life for me to get over that. And that's the story of one of the two young men that I wanted to talk about today, Santa Ono. The second young man I want to talk to you about today is Brogan Dully. I told you a little about him. Comes from a beautiful Catholic family in the northern suburbs of Cincinnati. He was a swimming coach, a talented swimmer, a student at the University of Cincinnati. In his case, on May 18th, 2015, I received a phone call from the chief of police at the University of Cincinnati saying that a young man had gone missing. Well, the University of Cincinnati is a big place. There's about 44,000 students. There's about 9,000 faculty and staff. It's a small city. And so it does occur several times a year, maybe a dozen or 15, where a student goes missing. So the fact that a student gone missing wasn't immediately a cause for alarm. But that one day became 2 days, 3 days, 6 days, 8 days, where no one could find him. His roommates in the apartment he lived in said they had been partying the night before he was missing. They had a good time. And he said to his roommates, "I left my cell phone. I need to go find my cell phone." Cincinnati has a lot of closed-circuit television, and so they actually saw him leaving and going to look for his cell phone, but he never returned. What's amazing is that during those 8 days, because he was loved by other students, because he was loved by his family and his high school friends, the whole city of Cincinnati actually went out looking all over Cincinnati to find Brogan Dully. It was amazing. And unfortunately, on the 8th day, I received another phone call from the chief of police of the University of Cincinnati. And he said, "A disturbance has been reported next door to the apartment where Brogan lived. The landlady had gone in I noticed something just wasn't right. UCPD actually went in. They went downstairs to the basement. It was dimly lit. Far at the other end of the basement, they found Brogan hanging. He had committed suicide in the basement of the apartment right next to where he used to live. It's one of the worst things that you have to deal with as president of a university. As I said, it happens a number of times in a small city like that. One of the worst things that you have to do is actually get up in front of those students. And there were hundreds of them, maybe thousands of them, carrying candles, and we sang Amazing Grace. It was amazing. But what I want to talk to you about is the book again, The Little Engine That Could. Here's a picture of Brogan when he was a swimming coach at the Turpin Swim Club with one of the little boys that usually lost in races. And to illustrate what kind of coach and human being Brogan was, he would tell them the story, The Little Engine That Could. And remember in that book there were little engines and big engines, all kinds of engines. And what he said to that boy is that don't value yourself against others. Don't value yourself on whether you win or you lose. Because I used to be a little kid, and I got bigger. And I kept saying to myself, I think I can, and I got better, and I got pretty good. What an amazing coach. So that's a story that Brogan used to tell the little kids, and they loved him. And I think it's sort of a message that I hope you all take with you moving forward. The other thing which is amazing is what his family did. This is his family, a loving family. And you can see on the right side of the slide a diagram with 9 squares. On the top left-hand square, you can see Brogan's glasses, a memory of Brogan. And in fact, my glasses today are chosen because I want to remember Brogan. The other squares actually are the 8 days. They're meant to signify those 8 days. And the kinds of values that you have here at Stockton, the kinds of values that Brogan's family feels during those 8 days when all of Cincinnati, thousands of people who didn't know him, fanned out across the city to try to find him. And their feeling is that if those values can be stressed and embraced, you can create the kind of safety net that will save lives. It's amazing that parents and siblings of someone who's just taken their life will come together and dedicate themselves once a year to remember those 8 days when they looked for Brogan and to try to push a message that will really create the kind of safety net that will save lives. Why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. First, at the University of Cincinnati, there were about 6,000 students in the freshman class. At the University of British Columbia, there are about 9,000 students in the freshman class. And I get to welcome them all to the university once a year. And they look happy. This is a pep rally where we encourage them all, welcome them all to the institution. But 1 in 4 of them, maybe even as much as 1 in 3 of them, and it's true here at Stockton as well, will experience mental health challenges. You know, I spoke at a TED conference called Imagine, and there's a song by John Lennon called Imagine. There's a little line in there that says, imagine that you're not the only one. That's a really powerful message I want you to remember, is that any of these kids, students, might during their time at university really deal with suicide, ideate about suicide, maybe attempt suicide. We don't know who they are. We need to do a better job trying to find them so we can help them before they actually spiral into more severe mental health problems. And so the reason why it's really important is that if you're feeling that way or you know somebody that feels that way, you're not the only one. And the louder we say that you're not alone, you're not the only one, the sooner we can get rid of the stigma and the sooner we can provide the help we hope that people need. Why did I start talking about this? I'm about to wrap up. I spoke at a fundraiser, and I spoke after this young lady called Jasmine Warga, who wrote a book, My Heart and the Other Black Holes. She told a story about the black hole in her heart when her best friends tried to commit suicide. And I spoke after her. And up until that moment in, I think, 2016, I never spoke about my 2 suicide attempts. And I said, if anybody can speak about their suicide attempts, it has to be me. I'm a tenured professor. I've been tenured for decades. I'm the president of a major university, at that time the University of Cincinnati. If anybody is in a position of strength to be able to speak about what happened in their life, it should be me. And the longer I don't talk about it, the longer I contribute to that stigma that's really inhibiting other people like me that need help. And Jasmine actually encouraged me to talk about my life. The great news is there's a lot of great things happening. This is an example of what's happening in Canada. The Canadian Mental Health Association has something called before stage 4. As I said, like cancer, there are 4 stages of severity of mental illness. The sooner you can identify somebody, the sooner that person gets in front of a professional, the more likely it is that you can stop them before they even think about suicide. This kind of national effort, where millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested by nations and governments, is needed to really address this growing problem. The country of England, for example, has a nationalized health service. They've done something amazing. They've done something that I hope occurs in every nation, and that is, and I've said this to President Obama when he was president, where he had a mental health summit. I said, you got to do something like this. In England, every single person, whether you're in the city of London, in the countryside, or a village, has access to 24/7 free talk, where you can actually go to see or call in to a counselor if you're feeling down or if you're thinking about suicide. That kind of national system is something that's very, very much needed, as well as the education about how to detect individuals that are struggling and what it is that you can do to help them. Even Prince Harry and Prince William are behind the effort. You can see that here with their wives and their girlfriend. You can see that they're saying, we have to put our heads together. We have to come together to build this web of support across all of England. And that's powerful. When people like Prince Harry and Prince William are talking about their mental health challenges, it becomes no longer a stigma. And what's happening here at Stockton University, here, in terms of peer education, what's signified by this month and your attendance here, talking about this honestly and transparently and educating each and every one of us to learn the signs that someone's in trouble, to learn about what you can do to help them. You are a model of what should happen in higher education. And the great thing is that social media is kicking in. You type in #depression on Instagram, you get taken to, can we help? What can we do? How can we talk to somebody? If you do this on Facebook, the same thing happens. Type in depression, you can talk to a friend, call a helpline, you can get different kinds of advice. And finally, companies such as Bell Atlantic, Bell Canada are getting involved in this effort that have actually brought millions of people together talking about mental health challenges, how you can be resilient, and what we can do. I am sure thousands of lives over the past decade have been saved because of this kind of corporate involvement in talking about mental illness. The last thing I want to do is say this, what can you do? There's so much you can do. First of all, you're being here, and you as a participant in this institution's effort to shine a light on this problem is a huge example for the rest of the world. I encourage you to love your neighbor, your friends, and if you're a professor or a residence hall supervisor, an administrator, or a peer, to keep your eyes open, to try to identify individuals that might not be showing up to class or might, having been a good student, start to show that their performance is dropping. Or maybe you see a friend who's not responding to texts anymore, something like that. Learn about what you can do. Don't turn your back on them. Use that as a reason to connect with them. Listen to them. Ask them what's going on. Learn about what you can do. And most importantly, don't overpromise, because the last thing somebody needs if they're depressed is to be disappointed again. It can be the last straw. So know what you can do and what you cannot do. But most importantly, connect them with the professional resources that exist here and encourage them. Hold their hand and walk them to that counselor or psychiatrist. Because when you're depressed and down in a ball in your room, you often don't have the self-motivation to go help yourself. Walk them directly to the help that they need. It will save their lives. So I want to conclude by saying thank you for being here. And go back to that story, The Little Engine That Could. I hope you see that all of us struggle, whether you're a little engine or a big engine. Fortunately, just last year, the goalie of our hockey team, who was a medical student, from the outside looked like a big, strong engine, a loving family, committed suicide. Nobody knew what was happening inside. So the struggles of mental illness affect all of us, little engines, big engines. And the only solution is what you're doing here at Stockton University right now. Thank you so very much for having me today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Do you have any questions?
I'm Don Cassidy. I'm director of the counseling staff, and I'm very old school, as I like to say, and I tell my students that in the psych class that I teach. But I'm becoming more and more aware of the power and the importance of social media, and even some helplines that are text-based. And I'm growing with the idea. You know, I like to be face-to-face with people, but I'm aware that telehealth, even over the internet, is a resource. But I know you're well followed on social media, and wonder if you'd help our new generation understand that that's how that can be helpful too, as well as our wellness center, J204.
Well, thank you very much. You're absolutely right that we're surrounded by digital natives. And one of the reasons that I've invested a lot of time on social media, and if any of you actually would want to connect with me, a lot of people actually do by direct message if you're struggling. My address on both Twitter and Instagram is at UBC, University of British Columbia, UBC Prez, P-R-E-Z or Z. So if you want to contact me, and wherever I go to speak, it's not uncommon that people will reach out to me and say, this is what I'm going through, can you help? It's the @UBCPREZ. So feel free to connect with me. I think it's really, really important. This generation often looks at the world through the lens of social media. They're very comfortable interacting with people virtually. And so I think that any institution needs to have both the in-person strategy and a virtual strategy of interacting with people. We're working with Microsoft and the University of California, Los Angeles. There are a lot of apps that are being created, and I've spoken about this with some individuals here. We'd love to share that expertise. We'd love to collaborate. There are things we can learn from Stockton. There are things, hopefully, that we can contribute to Stockton. But there are a number of apps that are being developed in Vancouver, but also at MSR, Microsoft Research, where those apps are meant to help university students sort of self-screen for whether they're well or not, whether they have mental illness or mental challenges, can help grade them privately and connect them with the kinds of resources that might be helpful to them. There are also attempts made when we have 9,000 freshmen like we do at University of British Columbia. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of time to screen all of them, but if we could, we would probably find 500 or 600 students that are grade 3 or grade 4 that really, really need help. If we could identify them in a confidential way, then we could get them the support that they need before they even think about committing suicide. So technology, I really think, is part of the solution. It's also part of the problem that people are using it so much that they might be in a residence hall and they're actually talking to their friend that's right next door by Twitter or Snapchat. I think one of the problems, one of the things that we've identified is the problem is a feeling of isolation. And so technology in a way creates that isolation, but since these are digital natives, it has to also be part of the solution. Thanks for the question. Any other questions?
Did your family have any role or knowledge of your treatment for your depression?
Well, since I mentioned about the fact that my parents felt I was not going to amount to anything, I really didn't feel comfortable speaking with them at all. And I think it's not because of my wife, because she's a terrific wife, but it's something that I did on my own. I was in Baltimore and she was in Boston, and she knew I was struggling, but she didn't really know everything that I went through in terms of the psychotherapy and all that. I think she knew I was on medication, but my wife's terrific, and the fact that I've gone to church, those were very, very important parts of how I was able to actually recover.
Hi, my question goes towards someone in my family that went through it. I was the one that detected that something was going on. My problem was being able to tell her mother and giving her the information she needed to help my niece through this. So what is it that you can tell me that I can let my sister know that it is an illness, it can be treated, but she had to be educated to understand that, this is something that could be common and she needed help with understanding herself.
I mean, that is often one of the biggest challenges, is that sometimes it's the relationship between the child and young adult and the parent, which is a big part of the problem. And so ironically, they're the last people that in some cases can be brought in to help that child or young adult. The fact that you've recognized it, I think is one avenue to try to educate the mother. Sometimes it doesn't work. And so sometimes if the mother or father don't want to hear anything about it, think you're intruding, it is a very complicated situation. So since it's so complicated, I don't want to give some sort of a knee-jerk reaction. I think that you're being involved, and to the extent that you can be supportive in an appropriate way, is the best that you can do. You can't really tell a parent to do something. And as a child, as a university student, you can go to their resources that are around you. If you were like I was at 14, I don't think that my parents would have reacted very well to a relative or a neighbor saying your son needs help. And so it's complicated. But I think the fact that you're engaged, and if you think you can have a positive impact on the parent, to say that your child is not alone, this is common. I mean, at the University of Cincinnati, we had a football game on national television, and all the students that were dealing with mental health issues held up a square color. I forgot whether it was yellow. I think it was yellow. And then there was an aerial view from the blimp above, and there was a whole student section. A third of the students held up a square. It's really important. You can say, your child is not unusual. They're not alone. And the sooner they realize that, and you realize that, and we give help to that child, the more likely it is that they'll get better. Thank you.
Hi. So you went to grad school and then later on became a professor. For students who are dealing with depression and are looking to go into grad school, what are some tips that you can give them to succeed?
That's a great question. I'm going to walk down this road because there were some questions over there too. But the question was, I was in University of Chicago, and I was dealing with depression all the way up until being a faculty member because I was not being treated. What advice do I have for university students such as yourself or others that are thinking about going to grad school? That's a great question. Graduate school is very different from undergraduate, from college. Often in a college or university setting, as an undergraduate, you're surrounded by peers, and especially at a place like Stockton Friendly, you have friendly peers that care about you. Graduate school is a much more solitary environment. Depending upon what graduate program you go into. So if, let's say, like you're a graduate student like I was all alone at a bench doing laboratory science, and most of the time the experiments would fail. And you sometimes have a faculty member or a supervisor, a thesis supervisor that's really there with you, and sometimes you have ones that are detached. They're different styles of different faculty members. So I would say that if you're going to graduate school, my advice would be to go into it with your eyes wide open, that it's a different kind of environment, a little bit less supportive than when you're an undergraduate, when you're in college. And if you are a student that knows that you need support, make sure you build that into your life. Make sure that you get involved in organizations and clubs and activities where you're surrounded by others that might be able to detect that you're struggling. And so intentionally build a support network is what I would say. Thank you. Any other questions?
So President Arnold, you mentioned that you waited until you were well established before you share your story. So what can you say to others who are in the process of getting help but are afraid of the stigma? And so what can you say to encourage them? Are we at a point that they can freely disclose or to get help?
That's a great question, and I want to be very careful in how I answer it. You know, when you're a tenured professor, and at that time, I had really been warmly received and supported as president of the University of Cincinnati. You really are in an unusual position of strength. The Board of Trustees is behind you. The governor is behind you. You have a lot of support from students, faculty, and staff. That's an unusual position. You're pretty secure. Now, I'll say there are still some risks at that level, and I'll explain them before, but I want to say very, very clearly that I'm not sure that if you look across the landscape of higher education, even within a single university, I'm not sure that any institution, maybe Stockton might be the #1 example, where we ought to get, but I don't think there's any institution where across the entire landscape or that institution, it's safe to talk about your struggles. I know for a fact that if you're not tenured, if you're a staff member that has you're working at will, that it's scary to talk about openly about your challenges because there are people who are judgmental, and I want to be totally honest that the position I'm in is very different from the position that others are in, and so my advice is you can reach out to me, you know, or other people like me, or people that that you know are going to be supportive and friendly. And my advice is to try to evaluate your microenvironment and ask yourself, do I have a supervisor? Do I have colleagues that are going to judge me or support me? We're not at a place where every microenvironment is going to be supportive. It's sort of like the LGBT community. You know, even at large universities, and I don't know about this one, we're going through a process of creating safe spaces because not every space in University of British Columbia is a safe space to come out as LGBTQ. And so the same kind of thing, I think we have to, in higher education, move to that kind of model where we can identify safe spaces to talk about one's challenges. And we're not quite as advanced as with the LGBTQ movement. Thank you. So my advice is be careful, but you certainly can communicate with me. There's somebody up here.
Hello. So when you were applying to the board or just being a teacher, if you told them that you had depression or some like minor bipolar, do you think they would still accept you?
That's a great question. Actually, I was not planning to talk about my depression, and it was at a fundraiser where I followed that young lady who inspired me, and I said, you know, very spontaneously, I said, I'm going to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, people that are in a position of strength don't talk about it, and the stigma persists, right? And that's why it's great that Prince Harry and Prince William are talking about it, and other celebrities. The more of us that actually that are safe to talk about it, the more progress we can make. To answer your question, the moment I talked about it, I was a finalist to become president of the University of British Columbia. And what some of you may know is that since most university presidents don't talk about their challenges, it went viral. If you go back to not only did I talk about it, but I tweeted about it. And at that time, I had about 77,000 followers on Twitter. So it became viral. I mean, thousands of people retweeted it, and newspapers and television stations around the world picked it up because it was so unusual that a university president would admit that they had ideated and actually attempted to commit suicide. So what happened? At the University of Cincinnati, the Board of Trustees treated it as a non-issue. Their confidence in me didn't change at all. They didn't exactly say that was great, you know, but they didn't start avoiding me and start talking about how to get rid of this president. They didn't do that, thank goodness. At that time, I was confidentially a finalist to be president of the University of British Columbia. In many ways, I loved, absolutely love, and to this day still love the University of Cincinnati. I love the city of Cincinnati. But remember, I was born in Vancouver. My dad taught there. And in all of our lives, there's some place that's really, really special. So this was sort of like a dream job for me. That's not answering your question. But I was a finalist for the presidency of the University of British Columbia. And so actually, they were deciding whether to offer me the job, to your question. And what blew me away is that they had already met me once. They were thinking about whether to invite me back to be, what happens is they start with several hundred people, and then they go down to about a dozen, and then they go down to about 4. And so I was at the stage of about 4 people that were seriously considering. And they could have said, we don't want this guy, he has bipolar disorder. You know, he's trying to commit suicide. Actually, one day read, because it was all over the news, that one of the people that they were seriously considering offering the job to had attempted suicide and was talking openly about his suicide attempts. Actually, to the contrary, they called back and said, we're actually more interested in you because it shows that you feel strongly about this and you want to do something about it. They were more interested in me, and maybe it helped me get the job, which I'll tell you was the case at University of British Columbia. May not be the case in other institutions, but to answer your question, it didn't hurt me at all. It actually helped me, and I'm very grateful for how I was treated by UBC. Any other questions? By the way, I always wanted to be a talk show host, so actually walking up and down steps with a microphone is sort of a dream come true.
So my question is, since your story is out in the open, in the public, how does your family react, and like, how do they think of you now? Did it change for the better?
You're talking about my current nuclear family or my family from which I was a kid? Both. Okay. Actually, it was a tremendous surprise for my wife and kids for me to start talking about it, because I hadn't talked about it even with them. And I have a sense, I've never talked to my kids about how they feel about me now that they know that, but I have a sense that they still love me. My wife has actually come to hear me speak in this kind of setting. I spoke in a very large church in Vancouver called 10th Church. It's actually online. She was there. I think she's supportive of what I'm trying to do, and I think that you know, in her family, in other families, this is something that exists in every family. It's nothing unique to my family. And so she's been supporting my parents now. How did they react? You know, I've never really talked to my parents directly about this. They learned about it because this went viral and it was on news around the world. And so there's no way they, and obviously somebody saw it and they said, did you see this about your son? You know, I think my mother summed it up best. She said, you know, I think that what you've accomplished in life is something that you built on your own, which was really, really nice. So I don't know exactly how they feel. It's sort of uncomfortable to talk to them about what I felt like as a kid and things like that. I think they really are loving parents, and I think they honestly felt that I was not going to amount to anything, and I think they're pleasantly surprised that I'm doing okay. So. All right. I want to thank you very much again. I really appreciate everything.
Okay. Nathan, you want to come up, please? Now, I just wanted to say, can we give another round of applause for Dr. Santa Ono? And at this point in time in the program, I wanted to once again acknowledge Nathan Morrell and the rest of the suicide prevention team. Those of you that are in the room, please stand and be recognized for your hard work in putting this together. And Nathan?
Three of my favorite words in the English language: free taco bar. That's happening now in the CD atrium as a way of celebrating and honoring Dr. Ono. So please come join us, hang out. Thank you for coming. Spread the word of what you did today. I think we choose love and not fear. And this love, it ripples out from this room, you know, and we share our stories. And from that sharing and from opening our hearts and connecting and pushing through those invisible walls, those kind of scary, fake invisible walls, we love this community into wellness. And this, you just saw it happen here, you know, and we can all bring that home. We can open the door, we can smile, we can share our kindness. Even in the simplest things, nothing is wasted. So I want to thank you all for coming, and please join us for some tacos and some conversation. Thank you.